Prisoner's dilemma is another example of where incentives play a great role when it comes to certain situations. So when it comes to prisoner's dilemma, it's just an example that illustrates the following concept. We say that rational individuals who act in their own best interest do things that makes them worse off. And sometimes those decisions make everyone worse off. So if you read these two sentences really carefully, and if you remember those things that we discussed in the beginning of the semester, that guy Adam Smith, who said that people who act in their own self-interest make themselves better off and make society better off. These two sentences really contradict what Adam Smith was saying. They say that sometimes people who act in their own interests make themselves worse off and make society worse off. So why is this happening? Why are there exceptions to the Adam Smith rules? So prisoner's dilemma example actually illustrates the possibility of a situation where people acting in their own interest make themselves worse off. So let's look at this example. Assume that police have caught Bonnie and Clyde, two suspected bank robbers, but only have enough evidence to imprison each for 1 year. The police is going to question each in separate rooms and offer each other the following deal. If you confess and implicate your partner, you go free. But now, police has enough evidence to put that person for 20 years. So if you do not confess, but your partner implicates you, you get 20 years in prison. The same works other way around. If you confess and your partner doesn't, your partner goes to prison for 20 years. If you both confess, now police have enough evidence to put each one of you in prison for 8 years. So this is setup of this prisoner's dilemma example. What we're going to do is we're going to put it in the following matrix, and we're going to see how the decisions are going to make. So we're going to put Bonnie's decisions on the top of the matrix, Clyde's decision on the left side of the matrix, and we're going to fill in this information in this square. So first, each one of our prisoners have two options, either to confess or remain silent. That's Clyde's possible strategy. The same applicable to Bonnie's. Bonnie can either confess or remain silent. So now if both prisoners confess, Clyde gets 8 years in prison and Bonnie gets 8 years in prison. Each one of them gets 8 years in prison if both of them confess, since now police has more evidence for them. What's gonna happen if Clyde confesses and Bonnie keeps silent? Well, the deal was offered to Clyde. If he confesses and implicates his partner, Clyde goes free. And since Bonnie keeps silent, but now police has more evidence to put her in prison, she goes to prison for 20 years. The other way around happens when Bonnie confesses, she goes free, and if Clyde remains silent, he gets 20 years in prison. And if both remain silent, each one of them gets 1 year in prison. So even though this is a very simplified example, if you watched Law and Order enough, you're probably going to see that this example actually happens in real life. The deals offered by police is pretty similar to what's described in this particular example. So obviously, if you just look at this table, you're going to see, well, it's really the best thing for both of the prisoners to keep silent and go to prison for 1 year. But we're going to be able to show that acting in their own interest, each of the prisoners is not going to keep silent, and each of the prisoners is going to confess, and as a result, they will go to prison for 8 years. So let's see how it works. This is a simplified version of the matrix we saw on the other slide. So this first number is going to be number of years Clyde spent in prison. So this 8, 20, 0, 1, those are the number of years in prison for Clyde. And the second number, the number of on the right, is going to be the number of years Bonnie can spend in prison given particular strategy. So let's ask ourselves the following question. If Bonnie somehow knew that Clyde would confess, what would be the best strategy for her? So now Bonnie is trying to make a decision. Somehow she knows that Clyde is going to confess. If Clyde is going to confess, Bonnie can either confess and go to prison for 8 years, or she can keep silent and go to prison for 20 years. So make sure that we're not comparing these first numbers, 8 and 0. We're comparing the number of years in prison that are applicable for Bonnie. So she can either confess and go to prison for 8 years, or keep silent and go to prison for 20 years. Which one will she choose? 8 years in prison looks better than 20 years in prison. So if she knew that Clyde is going to confess, her better option is to confess as well. If Bonnie somehow knew that Clyde would not confess, what would be the best strategy for her? So now Clyde is going to remain silent. What's the best strategy for Bonnie? She can confess and go free, spend 0 years in prison, or she can keep silent and go to prison for 1 year. So either 1 year in prison or 0 years in prison. Which one is better option for Bonnie? Confess as well. So what we can see that regardless of what Clyde is going to decide, confess or keep silent, Bonnie is going to confess. If Clyde decides to confess, the best option for Bonnie is confess. If Clyde decides to keep silent, the best option for Bonnie is confess as well. So no matter what Clyde decides to do, Bonnie is going to confess. Let's look at this example from Clyde's perspective. If he somehow knew what Bonnie would do, if he somehow knew that Bonnie would confess, what would be the best strategy for him? So Bonnie decides to confess, that's what Clyde thinks. So now Clyde looks at his options. He can either confess and go to prison for 8 years. We're looking at this first number, which represents number of years in prison Clyde can spend. Or he can keep silent and go to prison for 20 years. Which one is the better option for Clyde? Probably 8 years in prison compared to 20. If Clyde somehow knew that Bonnie is going to remain silent, what would his best option be? He can either confess and go to prison for 0 years, or he can keep silent and go to prison for 1 year. 0 years in prison probably is better than 1 year in prison. So Clyde is also going to confess. Given this information, we know that Clyde will for sure confess. Once again, regardless of what Bonnie decides to do, either confess or keep silent, for Clyde it's better to confess. We're comparing 8 years in prison to 20 and 0 years to prison to 1. So at the end of the day, we saw that both Bonnie and Clyde would confess and go to prison for 8 years, even though both of them would be better off keeping silent. So this example results in the following outcome. Both prisoners will confess and each will get 8 years in prison. Both would have been better off if both remained silent, but even if they agreed before being questioned to keep silent, the self-interest will drive them to confess. This outcome is called Nash equilibrium. Let's see who Nash is and why do we call this outcome Nash equilibrium. Nash is actually a mathematician. His full name is John Forbes Nash. He is a mathematician whose works in game theory have provided insights into the forces that give chance and events inside complex systems in daily life. Oh, a lot of things said. But what did he do? This mathematician proved that sometimes people acting in their own interest make themselves worse off. That sometimes people should not just act in their own interest, but also in the interest of society. And that's when everybody is going to benefit. So he illustrated with this prisoner's example, that incentives right? We are self-interest motivated, right? That's our incentives to make ourselves as well off as possible. Will lead to non-cooperation, which in return make us worse off. In fact, this person, John Nash, he received a Nobel Prize for coming up with this theory, for showing that us acting in our own self-interest is not necessarily going to make us better off.